At 19 minutes past 10 on Charter Day morning, a gray motorcar came up the service lane to the ash gate of Harrowgate Palace, and the guardsman on the arch would not let it through. I saw the whole of it from my window, because my window is the only window that looks straight down into that lane, and because looking down into that lane is my entire occupation. My name is Renacombe. I was then, and I am still keeper of the gate register at the ash gate, which is a grand way of saying that I sit in a stone box above an archway with a ledger the size of a paving slab, and I write down every wheel that turns through it. Coal, milk, linen, flowers, ice, coffins, plumbers, the fishmonger's van, the master of the household's little green runabout that he is far too proud of. Nothing enters the service side of the kingdom of Eldermore's chief royal house without a line in my book, and nothing leaves it without a second line, and if the two lines do not agree, I am the one who has to go down the stairs and ask why. Most days the book is the dullest object in the realm. That morning it was the only honest thing in Harrowgate. The car stopped under the arch with its engine running. That was the first wrong thing. Tradesmen cut their engines under the arch. It is a rule older than the engines themselves, from the days when you stood your horse and took off your cap. The second wrong thing was the hour. No vehicle was expected at the ash gate between 10 and noon on Charter Day. The whole household knew it, because the service lane had to stand clear for the fire pump and the ambulance wagon, which by ancient standing order sit ready at the mouth of it for the length of any state day. The third wrong thing was the car itself. A heavy gray saloon, mud to the axles, with dark cloth drawn across the rear windows on the inside, held up with drawing pins. Pins. I could see the little brass heads of them from 20 feet up. And the fourth wrong thing was the man behind the wheel, who did not look at the gate, or at the arch, or at the guardsman, but only forward, hands high on the wheel, the way a man looks when he has been told exactly what to say and is afraid of being asked anything else. The guardsman on the ash gate that morning was Ansel Rook. He had been on that arch 6 months, and I had watched him take the post the way another man takes a wife, carefully and for good. He was 26. Third company of the household guard, red wool tunic, the tall black bearskin, white gloves gone gray at the seams because he would not draw a fresh pair until the old pair was truly finished, which the quartermaster held against him. He was not a large man. He was long and narrow and quiet, and he had the flat calm of a boy raised somewhere with a great deal of weather in it, which he was. The fen country out past the Greve, where his father had kept a bridge and his mother had kept the accounts of the bridge, and where, so far as I could tell, a person was expected to be able to walk 20 miles and say nothing about it. He did not lift the bar. The driver leaned out. I could not hear the words at that distance, over the engine and the bells already testing themselves at the Abbey, but I did not need to hear them. The shape of the thing was plain. The driver held out a paper. Rook did not take it. Rook said something short. The driver said something longer. And then Rook did the thing that started everything, though at the time it looked like nothing at all. He stepped 1 pace to his left, so that he stood square in the center of the arch in front of the radiator, and he put his hands behind his back. That is not a threat. There is no threat in it. It is simply a man saying with his whole body, "This vehicle will not pass through me." I opened my window and called down, because that is my office. "Number and warrant, please." The driver's head came round to me fast, faster than he meant it to, and that told me more than his papers ever could. A man with a right to be somewhere looks up slowly. "Household order," he called. "Conveyance." "Then you'll have a warrant number, and I'll have it in my book." He read one out. I remember the pause before he read it, and I remember that he read it off the page rather than out of his head, which no palace driver in the world would need to do, because a palace driver's warrant number is his own name to him. He says it in his sleep. But the number was good. That is the part I have gone over 1,000 times since, in the small hours, with the ledger open on my knees. The number was *good*. It was a live household conveyance warrant, drawn on the proper series, in sequence, unexpired. I wrote it down. Ashgate Inward 1019 Grey Saloon hired plates warrant so-and-so purpose, conveyance household. And down below, Ansel Rook still did not move. The porter came out then, old Fenwick, who has a chair by the inner door and a stove, and 40 years of not caring for anything but the stove. And there was a small argument in the arch, and Fenwick waved his arm about, and the driver said the word *warrant several times loudly enough for me to catch it, and Rook stood in front of the radiator with his hands behind his back and let them all talk. It ended the way these things end. An equerry came down. He came down from the inner court on foot, in the black and silver of the king's household, gloves in one hand, a paper in the other, and he came with the particular unhurried walk of a man who has never in his life had to wait for a door to be opened for him. Lord Cassius, the Queen Consort's son by her first marriage, no blood of the king's at all, though you would not have known it from the way he wore the silver. He was perhaps 30. He had a very good tailor and a very bad temper, and the two of them together had made him a man that nobody in the service wing looked at directly. He did not raise his voice. That was his way. He came up close to Rook and spoke into the side of his face quietly, and Rook stood at attention and looked over his shoulder at nothing, as he was required to do, and answered. I could see his jaw move 3 times. 3 short answers. Then Lord Cassius put the paper flat against Rook's chest, against the red wool, and held it there, and said something and stepped back and looked up at my window. He looked directly at me. He knew exactly where the register office is. He smiled at me, a courteous, pleasant, empty smile, and he said, in a voice pitched perfectly to carry up 20 feet of stone, "Mistress Combe, enter it as admitted if you please." And I did. Reader, and I have said this at a hearing under oath, with the seal of the council on the table in front of me, and I will say it here, I did. I took my pen and I entered the gray car as admitted, and I watched the bar go up, and I watched Ansel Rook step aside, because when an equerry of the king's household gives a lawful instruction to a clerk of the gate, the clerk writes what she is told and the guardsman opens the gate, and that is what the whole enormous machine of the palace is built to do, and it has been built that way for 400 years for excellent reasons. And on that particular morning, it very nearly cost a 9-year-old girl everything she had. The gray car went through the arch at 10:23 and turned right, into the inner service court, and parked in the shadow of the laundry wall with its engine running and its curtains pinned. I wrote the time. I always write the time. Then I sat there, and I looked at the line I had just made in my book, and I felt something in my chest that I did not have a name for yet. You must understand what Charter Day is, or none of the rest of it makes sense. It is the oldest public day in Eldermore. Once a year the king goes down to the abbey and reads out, from the original vellum, the promises his house made to the realm when the realm consented to be governed. Then he comes back up the Kingsway in an open landau with the household cavalry ahead and behind, and the whole city stands in the street and decides, privately, one by one, whether it still believes him. It has more people in it than any other day of the year, 200,000 in the processional route, the papers said afterward, and every one of them is looking at the front of the palace. Which means, of course, that nobody at all is looking at the back. The king, Alaric, had gone down to the abbey at 9. Crown Prince Rowan had gone with him. Princess Adela, the king's sister, who commands rather more of the realm's affection than she has ever wanted, was out at the head of her regiment on the far side of the river and would not be back until the salute. Princess Ilara, Rowan's wife, the children's mother, was to take her place at 11 on the colonnade stand with the little ones beside her, which was the arrangement, which everyone knew, which was printed on the household order of the day that hung on a nail 3 feet from my elbow. And the Queen Consort, Morwenna, had let it be known that she would not be attending the abbey at all. She had a headache. She had had a headache in one form or another since the day she married into that house. I do not want to be unfair to her, so let me be exact instead. Morwenna was the king's second wife. The first, Queen Isolde, was 10 years dead and still the most present woman in Harrowgate. Her rooms were kept. Her letters were kept. Her name came up at dinner the way a candle comes up in a draught. Morwenna had spent a decade trying to stand somewhere that Isolde was not, and had found nowhere, and had grown a hard, bright shell over the failure of it. She had brought her own household with her, her steward, Pell Dorrance, a soft-footed man who kept accounts nobody else was allowed to see, her son Cassius, her daughter Verena, and in 10 years those people had crept into every corridor of the place. And she wanted the children. I mean that in a particular and legal sense, and I want to be precise, because it matters. There was a bill before the council that spring. Its short name was the Household Establishment Bill, and its long name was longer than my arm, and what it did, in effect, was to place the establishment of the king's grandchildren, their household, their governess, their allowances, their schooling, and the persons permitted to have care of them, under the authority of the consort's office rather than the parents' own. It was dressed up as good order and thrift. It had been drafted by Pell Dorrance. It had been sitting on the council's table for 4 months, going nowhere, because Princess Adela had read it in about 90 seconds flat and said, in front of 11 councillors, that she would rather see the consort given a regiment than a nursery, and because Princess Alara had wept once in front of the king and never again, and because King Alaric, a decent, tired, slow-moving man who had spent 10 years trying not to notice what he had married, had not been able to bring himself to sign it. That was the state of things on Charter Day morning. And down in the inner service court, in the shadow of the laundry wall, a gray hired saloon with pins in its curtains sat waiting with its engine running. I did not at first do anything about it. I want to be honest. I sat in my box and I looked at my ledger and I told myself the number was good, the equerry was lawful, the entry was made, and it was not my business what a household conveyance conveyed. It was Rook who would not let it alone. He came up my stairs at 22:11 off his post, which even then made me stare, though he had it covered. His relief Barlow had come up early because Barlow was hoping to be swapped onto the colonnade line where the girls were. Rook came up the stairs 2 at a time and stood in my doorway with his bearskin under his arm, and his hair was flattened to his skull with sweat, and he looked, for the first time in 6 months, like a young man rather than a fixture. "Mistress Combe," he said, "read me the warrant." "You've seen the warrant." He held it to your chest. He held it, he didn't let me read it. Rook's voice did not go up. It never did. It got flatter and quieter, and that turned out to be the thing to be frightened of. "Read me the number." I read him the number. He stood very still. Then he said, "Read me the number you entered on Tuesday, the linen van." I turned the pages back and read it. "And the coal Thursday." I read that too. He nodded slowly, and I understood with a cold drop in the stomach what he was doing, and I did it myself then properly, running my finger down the column, because a household conveyance warrant is drawn in a sequence, and the sequence is issued in books of 50, and the books are issued to offices, and each office's book runs in its own band of numbers, and any clerk who has kept a gate register for 11 years knows those bands the way a shepherd knows sheep. The linen van was in the master of the household's band. The coal was in the board's band. The gray car's warrant was not in any band that had any business at the ash gate. It was drawn from the small private book issued each quarter to the office of the Queen Consort, the book that pays for her flowers, her dressmaker, her cousin's rail fares, and her steward's dinners. And it had been drawn 3 days before Charter Day. 3 days, Rook said. He was looking out of my window down at the arch. Somebody made a plan on Tuesday. "It's a warrant," I said. "It's not a crime. She may send a car anywhere she likes." Yes, he said. Cassius signed it in. Yes, he said, and he did not move, and outside the Abbey bells started their first full peal, and the whole of Harrowgate turned toward the front of the house like a field of wheat turning in a wind. Then Rook said, without any particular emphasis at all, "The Princess Malin came down to the gate at 9:30 to see the horses go out. She does it every charter day. She told me she was to be on the colonnade stand at 11 with her mother, and she was cross about it, because she wanted to be with the horses, and she asked me whether a person could be excused a stand on the grounds of being 9. He turned round. "So can you tell me," he said, "why the porter's book downstairs has a note in a hand I don't know, that says the Princess Malin is to be conveyed to His Majesty at the Abbey at 10 minutes to 11, when His Majesty left this house at 9, and there is no child on the Abbey list, and there has never in the history of this realm been a child brought late and alone into the middle of a charter reading." The bells went on. I got up out of my chair so fast that my pen went over, and the ink ran across the line I had written at 10:23, and it is there still. You can see it, if you ever have cause to look at that book, which is now kept behind glass and not by me. A long black smear across the words purpose, conveyance, household asterisk, like something spilled at the exact moment somebody understood. There is a way to do this properly. Rook did it properly. I want that on the record because of what was said about him afterward by men who were not there. He did not run to the nursery. He did not seize the driver. He did not go up the back stairs and hammer on the consort's door, which is what I would have done, and which would have ended with him in a cell by noon and the gray car gone by 5 past. He went to his sergeant major. Otho Grange had been 31 years in the household guard, and had the face of a man who had been rained on for every one of them. His office was a cupboard off the guardroom with a coal stove and a photograph of a company that had mostly not come home. I went with Rook, because I had the book, and because by then my hands were shaking and I did not want to be alone with what was in it. Rook stood at attention and made his report in 11 sentences. I counted them afterward. A gray hired saloon admitted at 10:23 on a conveyance warrant drawn from the consort's private book on Tuesday. The vehicle standing in the inner court with its engine running and its rear windows covered from within. A note in the porter's day book, in an unidentified hand, directing that Princess Malin be conveyed to the Abbey at 10:50. The king departed at 09:00. No child on the Abbey list. The princess herself at 09:30, expecting to attend the colonnade stand with her mother. He asked that the vehicle be held and its driver questioned. He asked that the princess's governess be informed. He asked for nothing else. Grange listened to all 11 sentences without moving. Then he said, "Who signed the car in?" "Lord Cassius, Sergeant Major." And I watched the whole of Otho Grange's face close, like a door in a wind. "Wait here," he said, and went to find the officer of the guard. I have thought about that moment more than is good for me, because Grange believed him. I saw belief go across the man's face like weather. And then I saw the second thing come across it, on top of the first. The plain, careful, 31-year knowledge of what happens to a sergeant major who takes a guardsman's suspicions about the Queen Consort's son to an officer on charter day morning with the king out of the house. He went anyway. I will always give him that. He went anyway. He came back with Captain Bramwell Doyne. Doyne was 40, handsome in a bloodless way, and possessed of the most dangerous quality an officer can have, which is not cruelty but carefulness. He was a man who had worked out very early that in a palace nothing is ever punished so severely as being wrong at the wrong moment, and he had built a career out of never being either. He had a good war behind him. He had a better set of connections in front of him. He read my ledger for the length of a breath. He read the porter's day book, which Grange had brought for slightly longer, and then he said the sentence I still hear. "Guardsman, are you telling me that the Queen Consort of Eldermore is stealing a child out of the back of her husband's house at 11 o'clock in the morning, with 200,000 people in the street. No, sir, Rook said. I'm telling you there is a car in the inner court that shouldn't be there, and a note about the princess that shouldn't be there, and that the two of them arrived on the same warrant book. I'm asking that the car be held for a quarter of an hour, and the driver be asked one question. What question? Where he's been told to take her, sir. Doyne put my ledger down on Grange's desk and squared it to the edge of the desk, and that small movement told me exactly how it was going to go. The warrant is good, he said. Yes, sir. The equerry's instruction is lawful. Yes, sir. The consort may send a car for a member of her own household. The princess, Rook said, is not a member of her household. She is the daughter of the crown prince. There was a silence in that cupboard of a room that I can still feel on my skin. Doyne looked at Rook for a long moment, and I understood that he was not weighing the evidence at all. He was weighing the guardsman. You broke ranks in the Green Court in March, he said, to catch an old man who was falling. Yes, sir. You were told then that a guardsman's judgment is not required, and is in fact a liability, and that the day you decide the household is wrong and you are right is the day you take off that tunic. Yes, sir. I was told that. And here you are again. Yes, sir, Rook said, here I am again. Doyne took his gloves out of his belt and began to draw them on. There is a state procession forming in 20 minutes, he said, and I have 4 companies to place. I'm not going to hold a household car on a gate clerk's arithmetic and a guardsman's asterisk feeling. He looked at me when he said gate clerk asterisk, and I felt it, and I have not forgotten it. Sergeant Major, this man is off the Ash Gate. Put him on the colonnade barrier. The far end by the fountain where he can do no harm. Guardsman Rook, you will attend me tomorrow at 9, and we will discuss your fitness for household duty. Sir, said Rook. Say it back. Colonnade barrier far end by the fountain, Rook said. Attend you at 9, sir. Good. Doyne went to the door and stopped, and did the thing that I think about most of all, the small courtesy that men like him always have to hand, and that costs them nothing and that they mistake for kindness. He turned round and said, quite gently, It does you no discredit, Rook. It's the fen in you. You lot are all-weather watchers. And he smiled and went out to place his 4 companies. Grange stood looking at the closed door. Then he said to nobody, 10 minutes to 11, and to Rook, the far end of the colonnade barrier is 140 yards from the mouth of the Ash Lane, lad, and it looks straight down it. Rook's head came up. That's not an order, Grange said. That's a fact about geography. Get on your post. Here is what was happening in the other half of the house, while the men in the guardroom were being careful. I have all of this from the hearing, and from Belle Havers herself, who told me the whole of it afterward in my own kitchen with her hands round a cup she never drank from. She was the Princess Malin's governess. She had been 11 years in that nursery. She had taught Rowan's children their letters, and she loved them in the fierce, unsentimental, slightly cross way of a woman who has spent 11 years getting mud off small coats. And when I say that she would have gone into fire for them, I am not making a figure of speech, because 2 years later, at Aldergrove, she did. At 10:20, a footman brought Mistress Havers a note. The note was on the Crown Princess's own paper, in what looked very like the Crown Princess's own hand, and it said that Princess Alara had gone down early to the colonnade stand, and would be glad if Mistress Havers would come at once to the Silver Room, on the far side of the palace, to receive the children's cloaks, which had been sent to the wrong place. It was a completely ordinary note. It was the sort of note that gets written 40 times a day in a great house. Belle Havers put on her coat and walked 8 minutes across Harrowgate to the Silver Room, and found nobody there, and no cloaks, and waited 11 minutes because that is what a well-trained servant does, and then walked 8 minutes back. She was gone 27 minutes. At the same time, I have this from the colonnade stand's own staff, and it was gone over at length. Princess Ilara was met at the foot of the stand stair by Pell Dorrance, the consort's steward, who told her with great regret that there had been a change of order and the royal party would enter by the eastern stair, and would Her Royal Highness be so good as to come round. It added 4 minutes. 4 minutes is nothing. It is the length of time it takes to walk round the outside of a stand and up the other side, and it meant only that between 10:42 and 10:46 the crown princess was in a stone passage under the colonnade with no view of anything, being politely handed along by a man she did not much like. And Lady Verena, the consort's daughter, who was 23 and whatever else she was, no one's fool, had taken the Princess Malin and her brothers down to the nursery courtyard at 10 o'clock to see the pigeons, which she had never once in her life done before, and had then discovered that she had left her gloves indoors, and had asked Malin to wait just there, just by the arch, just for a moment, while she fetched them. None of these things is a crime. That is the whole horror of it. Every single piece of it taken alone is a note, an errand, a change of stairs, a pair of gloves. It is only when you lay them side by side in a column, the way you lay entries in a register, that you see that between 10:20 and 10:11 on Charter Day morning, every adult in the kingdom of Eldermore who loved that child had been quietly walked out of the room. That is the part that made the council go silent at the hearing when I read it out. Not the column. Ansel Rook took his post at the far end of the colonnade barrier at 8 minutes to 11, and stood where he was told and faced the front, and did not look down the ash lane. There were 4 ranks of people at that barrier, and every one of them was happy. There were flags. There was a woman selling roasted nuts who had been selling roasted nuts on that corner since before I was born. There were children up on shoulders. The household cavalry band was working through the Charter March for the 3rd time, and somewhere behind him, up on the colonnade stand, the household was assembling under the canopy, and the king's landau was already turning out of the abbey close a mile away, and the noise coming up the Kingsway toward him was the particular enormous good-natured roar of a city that has decided to enjoy itself. He stood in the middle of all of it, at attention, eyes forward, white gloves on the rifle, and every part of him that was a guardsman held its place. And the part of him that was a bridge-keeper's son from the fen, the part that had spent a childhood learning to read a river, to know from the color of the water at 4 in the afternoon whether the timber would come down that night, the part that Captain Doyne had called weather-watching as though it were a joke, that part of him was counting. Because from the far end of the colonnade barrier, without turning his head 1 degree, using only the edge of his eye, which is a thing every man who has ever done 4 hours of motionless sentry duty learns to do or goes mad, Ansel Rook could see 140 yards down the mouth of the ash lane. And at 4 minutes to 11, he saw the gray car come out of the inner court and turn and stop under the arch and open its rear door. And he saw the small figure in the pale coat walking toward it, hand in hand with a woman in a nurse's gray, with a man in household livery walking a half-step behind them both. The bells were on the 3rd stroke of 11. And Ansel Rook, who had been told he was off that gate, who had a hearing at 9 the next morning about his fitness to wear the tunic, who had 1 warning already in his file, and a mother and 2 sisters in the fen who were kept on his pay, Ansel Rook did the arithmetic of his own life in the space of about a second and a half. He shouted. Across 140 yards, over a brass band in a city, he shouted her name, and the sound came out of him like something torn. Malin. She heard him. That is the one mercy in the whole of that minute, and I hold on to it. Across 140 yards of stone and noise, that child heard her name in a voice she knew, and she stopped, and she turned round, and she looked back up the lane toward the colonnade with her hand still in the woman's hand. She told the council, later in a small clear voice, exactly what happened next. She said, I saw a red coat by the fountain and I knew it was him because of how he stands. And I said, "That's the Rook, I want to say hello." And the lady said, "We haven't time, my lamb, your grandfather is waiting," and she pulled my hand a bit. And I said the Rook doesn't wave when he's on duty but he blinks at me, and she pulled my hand rather harder than that. And then I didn't want to go. I want to write that sentence again, because it is the truest sentence in this whole account, and it was spoken by a 9-year-old. And then I didn't want to go. She pulled back. She was 9 years old and she weighed as much as a sack of flour, and she pulled back against a grown woman's arm in the middle of her own family's house. And she said, several witnesses under the arch heard it, including old Fenwick, who was standing 4 feet away with his hands in his pockets, and who has not forgiven himself since. She said, quite loudly and quite reasonably, "I am supposed to be with my mother." And the woman in the nurse's gray put her hand on the back of Malin's head, the way you steady a child getting into a car, and she said, "Of course you are, my lamb. That's where we're going." And the man in household livery took the other side, and between the two of them, in about 4 seconds, without a raised voice, without one single thing that a bystander could have named as violence, they had her into the back of the gray saloon and the door was shut. That is how it is done, not with a sack and a shout, with a lie, a hand on the head and a livery coat in broad daylight in front of a porter who has been told there is a warrant. Fenwick said afterward, and he wept when he said it, that the whole thing looked so ordinary that he had already gone back to his stove before the car pulled away. 140 yards up the lane, Ansel Rook came off his post. I have never seen anything like it, and I never will again. I was at my window. I had gone back up there because I could not sit still in the guardroom, and the register was the only thing I had. So I saw the barrier from above, and I saw the red line of the colonnade break. He did not step back out of the rank and salute and request permission. There was no time in the world for that, and he knew it. He put his rifle into the hands of the man beside him, Guardsman Barlow, who was so astonished that he took it, and he went over the barrier. Not through the gate in it, over it. He put one white glove on the rail and swung, and the bearskin came off his head in the air, and he did not look back at it, and it rolled into the road behind him, and a small boy picked it up and held it above his head for the rest of the day like a trophy from a war. And he ran. I had known Ansel Rook for 6 months as a man who stood still. I did not know nobody at that barrier knew, though his company knew, and Grange knew, and it was in his papers if anyone had ever bothered to read them. That Rook had won the household's long course 3 years running, the 12-mile run round the Wall Road with a pack on, and that he ran it every morning before parade because he could not sleep past 4, and that on the fen a boy who cannot run home ahead of the tide simply does not get home. He came across that forecourt like something let off a leash. There were people in his way. Charter Day, remember, hundreds of them packed 6 deep at the rail. He did not push anyone. That is the thing the newspapers got wrong, all of them, and I have corrected it in print twice. He did not knock people down. He found the lines the way water finds a channel, and he went through that crowd with his hands up and open, and his voice going ahead of him, "Make way, make way, make way." And the crowd, seeing a royal guard in a red tunic with no hat on and his face like a man who has seen the sea coming, did what crowds almost never do, which is get out of the way in time. Sergeant Major Grange saw him coming from the guardhouse door and stepped into the lane to stop him, because that is what a sergeant major is for. Rook did not slow down and did not go round. He said one word as he came. I was above them and I heard it, and it went into me like a nail, and the word was Otho. Not sergeant major, his name. In 31 years I do not suppose more than 4 men had ever called Otho Grange by his name. And Grange, God bless him for the rest of time, stepped aside and let him through and then turned and roared down the lane after him. The car's gone east, lad. It turned east at the wall. The gray saloon left the Ash Gate at 11 and turned east, away from the Kingsway, away from the procession, away from every policeman and every camera and every soul in the city, into the tangle of small streets behind the palace called the Quarter, where the streets are the width of a cart and 800 years old and go nowhere in particular except, eventually, out. Rook reached the mouth of the lane about 40 seconds behind it, and it was already out of sight. 40 seconds. On foot in a city against a motor car, 40 seconds is the end of the world. He stood in the road. I could see him from my window, small now, a red mark on the gray, standing absolutely still in the middle of the empty lane, while behind him the band played the Charter March, and the King's landau came up the Kingsway to the sound of 200,000 people, cheering a man reading out the promises of his house. And he turned round and went to the mews. The royal mews of Harrowgate sit behind the laundry court behind an arch called the Farrier's Arch, and on Charter Day they are the emptiest buildings in the kingdom, because every animal and every man that can be spared is out on the route. There was a motor lorry in the yard. The forage lorry, and Rook got into it and turned the crank, and it did what forage lorries have always done and always will do, which is nothing whatsoever. And there was Dabney Quill. Old Dab was head groom, and had been since before the king was king, and was 71, and was standing in the door of the long stable with a bucket in each hand because he had refused, for the 11th year running, to be given the day off. He watched a hatless guardsman throw himself out of the cab of a dead lorry, and he said, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who has spent 60 years around large animals that must never be startled, "What's happened, Ansel?" Because Rook had been mews-posted, 2 years of it before the guard took him. He had mucked out that stable, and Dab had taught him to sit a horse properly, and had told him more than once that he had the hands for it and the sense for it and no ambition worth speaking of, which was meant kindly. "They've taken the Princess Malin," Rook said. "A gray car, east into the Quarter, 4 minutes. There is no version of this story in which anybody sensible believes that sentence. Old Dab looked at him for perhaps a second and a half. Then he put down both buckets and said, "Salter." Salter was a gray, a big raw-boned Irish-bred gelding, 17 hands, the drum horse's understudy, who had never in 8 years been asked to do anything faster than a walk down a straight road with 2 kettle drums and a man in a leopard skin on his back. He had a mouth like a church door and a temper like a hearthrug. He was the wrong horse in every particular except one, which is that he was the only horse in that stable that was already saddled, because Dab had been about to walk him out to settle his nerves for the salute. Dab had the bridle on him in 11 seconds. I have this from Dab. He timed it afterward out of some old professional pride, standing in the empty yard with his hands shaking. "He'll not turn quick," Dab said, holding the head. "He'll not stop quick neither. Don't fight him, he'll only lean. Point him and leave him alone." Rook got up. "Ansel," Dab still had the cheekpiece. "You know what this is?" "Yes." "Off your post, on a horse that isn't yours, out of the mews without an order on a state day." The old man's face did not change at all. "They'll break you." "Yes," Rook said. "Let go." He let go. The Farrier's Arch comes out on Cutter's Row, and Cutter's Row goes east. Now I am a clerk. I have never sat on a horse in my life, but I have talked to 11 people who were in Cutter's Row that morning, and they all say the same thing in slightly different words, and none of them has ever got over it. They saw the street empty. Charter Day, everybody was 2 streets west at the barriers. There was a boy with a handcart of cabbages. There was a woman washing a step. There was a dog. And then there was a noise like a roof falling, and a gray horse the size of a hall door came out of the Farrier's Arch at a flat gallop with a royal guard on its back in a red tunic and no hat, standing in the stirrups, low over its neck, going east. The woman with the step said the sparks came off the cobbles. The boy said the horse's feet made a sound in his chest. The dog, by every account, simply sat down. He went up Cutter's Row, and he did not look for the car in it, because he knew the car would not be in it. Here is the thing that saved that child's life, and it was not courage. Courage was only what it cost him. It was that Ansel Rook had spent 2 years in the mews driving forage carts and taking horses to the farrier and running errands for Dabney Quill through every alley in the eastern city. And he knew, the way you know your own house in the dark, that a heavy motor car cannot go anywhere it likes in the quarter. The quarter is a knot. A car can enter it at 4 places and leave it at 2, Sheepgate, which goes north to the border road, and the Grieve Bridge, which goes east across the river to the coast. Everything else is stairs, bollards, and 800-year-old corners that a saloon simply cannot turn. So he did not chase. Chasing was hopeless, and he knew it in the first 40 seconds, standing in the empty lane, which is why he stopped. He cut asterisk. He put Salter up the corn steps, which is a flight of 11 shallow stone steps that horses have gone up since the city was young, and which no motorcar has ever gone up, and out along the top of the old wall, and down the ramp at Weaver's Turn, and he came out onto the Sheepgate Road 400 yards ahead of where any car leaving the quarter for the north could possibly be, at 6 minutes past 11, 3 minutes after the gray saloon had turned east out of the Ash Gate. He pulled the gray horse up in the middle of the Sheepgate Road, across it, sideways, blowing, and he sat there with his hand up, and he stopped a milk float and a bicycle and a cart of scaffolding poles, and the gatekeeper came out of his hut, and Rook said, in a voice that the gatekeeper described at the hearing as asterisk perfectly calm, which was the frightening thing about it. A gray saloon, hired plates, curtains pinned in the back, has it come through? Nothing's come through, soldier, the gatekeeper said. Not since 9:30, it's charter day. There's nothing moving in the whole north of the city. And Ansel Rook sat on a borrowed horse in the middle of an empty road with his lungs burning, and understood that he had guessed wrong, and that the car had not come north, and that he had put himself 400 yards up the wrong road, with a 9-year-old girl going the other way in the back of a car with pins in its curtains. He had, at that moment, no idea in the world where she was. I have asked him about that minute. Once. He does not like to talk about it, and I do not press him because I know what he is protecting, not himself but her, from the knowledge of how close the whole thing came to going the other way. But he told me this much. He said that he sat on the horse in the Sheepgate Road, and the sweat ran into his eyes, and the bells of the city were all going at once for the charter, and for perhaps 10 seconds, he was of no use to anybody alive. He said the fear was not like fear in a fight. He said it was like standing on the bank in the fen at night and hearing a child in the water and not knowing which way the water is running. And then he said, and this is the whole of the man, and I have never heard anything that explains him better, he said. So I stopped being frightened and started being a bridge-keeper's son. Because a bridge-keeper's son does not ask where has it gone. He asks, what does the water do? He shut his eyes on that horse in the middle of that road, and he went back through the morning the way you go back through a ledger, line by line, from the top. 10:19, a gray saloon at the Ash Gate, engine running. The driver, high on the wheel, looking forward. The driver, reading his own warrant number off the page. The mud on the car, not street mud, river asterisk mud, gray and up the sills, and dried in that particular chalky bloom that river mud dries in, and that a man from the Grieve knows on sight the way a farmer knows a wheat blight. And the driver's boots, Rook had looked at his boots, because he looked at everything, because looking at things was the entire content of his working life, and the boots had been wet to the ankle. And the little brass toll token, hanging from a string on the mirror, of the kind they give you at the Grieve toll house for the 12 crossing book. And one more thing. Old Fenwick, the porter, standing in the arch at 9:30 with his hands in his pockets, being asked a question by a man he did not know, and answering it, and thinking nothing of it, and repeating it to me afterward in a voice that could not get above a whisper. The driver had asked him, "What time do they lift the bridge?" The Greve Bridge is the only crossing of the river east of the city. It carries the coast road, and the coast road goes to the marches. And beyond the marches is the border, and beyond the border, as we would all learn within the week, is the Institute at Vance Hollow, a private establishment for the daughters of good families, which does not permit visitors in the first term, and which had, 3 days earlier, received a deposit of 400 crowns from an account controlled by Mr. Peldorance. And the Greve Bridge is a bascule. It lifts. It lifts for the timber barges, and the timber barges come up on the tide, and the bridge master raises the leaves on the hour and holds them for as long as the string of barges takes to pass, which on a spring tide is 14 minutes and can be 20. And it was 11:05. Ansel Rook opened his eyes and turned Salter's head, and said afterward that the horse, who had never done anything faster than a walk with a drum on his back, who was 17 hands of good-natured uselessness, who was blowing like a bellows and had a mouth like a church door, swung round under him and went east without being asked, as if he had been waiting his whole life to be part of something. The distance from the Sheepgate to the Greve Bridge, if you go by the road, is 2¼ miles. If you go over the old wall and down through the fish lane and across the corn market and out onto the wharf, it is a little under a mile, and there are 3 places in it where a horse cannot go. He went that way. They still talk about it on that side of the city. I have heard it told by people who were not born when it happened, and it grows in the telling. In the version they tell now, he jumps the corn market stalls, which he did not, and he rides through the fish market, which he did not, because the fish market on Charter Day is a solid mat of people, and he would have killed somebody. What he actually did was harder and less romantic, and I think much braver. He rode as far as the top of the fish lane, and then he got off. He got off a horse that was carrying him at 15 miles an hour toward the only chance that child had, because ahead of him the lane narrowed to 9 feet and filled up with people in barrows and hanging nets, and a 17-hand gelding at a gallop in that lane would have been a disaster with a red coat on it. He got off, and he took perhaps 1 second, and I have it from a fishmonger's daughter who was standing at her father's slab and who was 14 years old and who is now a magistrate. He took 1 second to put his hand flat on that horse's neck, and then he let go of the reins and he ran. The girl at the slab said the horse followed him. Not at a gallop, at a great long clattering walk, head down, right through the middle of the fish market, 60 yards behind a running guardsman, scattering barrows and being sworn at, and it came out at the bottom of the lane and stood on the wharf blowing, and it was still standing there an hour later when they came to fetch it, and old Dab wept when he heard, which nobody had ever seen him do. Rook went down the fish lane on foot. He went down it shouting, not * make way now, he had no breath left for courtesy, shouting one word over and over, and the word was, bridge. And here is the thing about a city. You may think a city is a crowd, and a crowd is a stupid, slow, selfish animal that will not move for anybody. On most days you would be right. But there is a thing that happens very rarely, when a whole street of ordinary people sees a man running past them in a torn red tunic with no hat and no rifle and his face open with terror, running toward something, and it goes through them like a current, and they do not know what it is, and they do not need to. The fish lane got out of his way. The fish lane, moreover, came with him, not all of it. But a boy on a bicycle went ahead of him, ringing his bell all the way down and clearing the market cross, and 2 porters from the corn market, big men in aprons, ran alongside for 100 yards and then peeled off and started shouting at the top of the wharf steps. And a woman selling flowers stood up on her box and screamed at the crowd below her to open, and it opened. Nobody knew why. Not one of them knew why. He came down the Cooper's steps to the wharf, 38 steps, and he went down them the way water goes down them, and he came out into the open at the head of the Greve Bridge at 11 minutes past 11. And the bridge was up. The two great leaves of it stood open against the sky like a book held wrong, and the bells on the bridge house were ringing, and the first of the timber barges was sliding through the gap with a man on the bow eating his lunch, and on the near side of the raised leaves, stopped, hemmed in, engine idling, boxed between a coal lorry in front and a brewer's dray behind, packed in among 30 other vehicles on a wharf that was solid with people, was a heavy gray saloon, mud to the axles, with dark cloth pinned across the rear windows. I was not there. I want to be honest about that, as I have tried to be honest about all of it. I was in a stone box above the ash gate with an ink stain on my ledger and my hands over my mouth. But there were 400 people on the Greve Wharf that morning, and 31 of them gave statements, and 11 of them were called, and I have read every word of it, and what follows is not my imagination. It is the reconstructed, sworn, cross-examined record of 11 minutes, and I have set it down here in the order it happened, because I think it is the finest thing I have ever had to write in my life. He did not go along the queue. There was no room along the queue. He went over it, over the tailboard of the brewer's dray, across the barrels, down onto the roof of the car behind, and he did not go over the gray saloon's roof, because a man who lands on the roof of a car has told the driver exactly where he is, and Ansel Rook had been thinking, hard and cold, for the entire length of the Cooper's steps. He went down between the dray and the saloon, and he came at the driver's door from behind and low, and he had it open before the man knew he was in the world. Bertil Crane, that was the driver's name, a hired man out of a livery yard on Cutter's Row, 44 years old, in debt, and not, as it turned out, a wicked man so much as a weak one. Bertil Crane told the court that the first he knew of any of it was a hand coming into the car past his shoulder and turning off his engine. Not on his throat, on his ignition. Crane went for the door handle on the far side, and Rook had him by the collar and out onto the cobbles, and Crane came out swinging, because he was 44 and frightened and had a great deal to lose, and there was, in the whole of that morning, exactly one blow struck, and it was struck by Bertil Crane, and it took Ansel Rook across the mouth, and it did not move him. Rook put him face down on the wharf with a knee in his back and both his wrists in one white glove, and looked up, and said to the two corn market porters who had run the last 100 yards, and arrived behind him with their aprons on and their mouths open, "Sit on this man. Somebody fetch the provost's men. Don't hurt him. Don't hurt him." That is in 3 separate statements. He had a girl behind a pinned curtain 4 feet away and blood on his lip, and what he said was, "Don't hurt him." And then he turned round to the rear door of the gray saloon, and the rear door of the gray saloon was locked from the inside, and behind the glass, holding the handle with both hands, was the woman in the nurse's gray. Her name was Ilse Fenn. She had been the Queen Consort's dresser for 6 years, and had been dismissed for cause in the spring, and had been quietly kept on a private allowance ever since. She was 51 years old. She had a wide, pleasant, entirely respectable face, the sort of face that porters wave through, and she was, I am told, quite calm. She held the handle and she looked at him through the window, and she said, the woman selling shrimps 2 yards away heard it perfectly, and repeated it to the court in a voice of pure disgust. "You have no authority here, guardsman. This is a lawful conveyance. Stand away from the vehicle." And Ansel Rook, hatless, unarmed, off his post, out of his mind with 11 minutes of fear, with his lips split and a whole wharf watching, did not shout at her, and did not break the glass, and did not put his fist through anything at all. He put both hands flat on the roof of the car, and he leaned down to the window, and he said, quietly enough that only the first 2 rows heard it, and loudly enough that they all repeated it exactly the same way, "Mistress, in about 90 seconds there are going to be a great many people around this car. You may open that door and hand her out and walk away from it standing up, or you may hold that handle, and I will take it off, and you will not walk away from anything for the rest of your life. I don't much mind which, but you are going to let go of that door." There was a pause of, by the shrimp seller's estimate, 4 or 5 seconds. And then a small fist hit the inside of the rear window from the other side, 3 quick, hard, deliberate knocks, and a voice came through the glass, muffled and thin and absolutely furious, and it said, "Rook, I'm here." And Ilse Fenn's respectable face came apart. She let go of the handle. She said afterward at her trial that she let go because she saw the crowd. I do not believe her. I think she let go because a 9-year-old put her hand through a curtain in front of 400 people and said the guardsman's name, and there is not enough livery in the world to survive that. Rook opened the door. They tell it in the songs and the cheap papers and the storybooks they sell to visitors now, as though he pulled her out and held her up over his head, and the whole city roared. He did not. He knelt down. That is what the record says. 11 sworn statements, and every one of them says the same thing, and it is the detail that undid the council chamber when it was read out, and it is the detail that undoes me still. He knelt down on the cobbles by the open door of that car, so that his face was below hers, because she was 9 years old and she had had a very bad 11 minutes, and the last thing on God's earth she needed was another large person standing over her. And he put out one hand, palm up, not touching her, and he said, "Your Highness, are you hurt anywhere?" And Malin said, "No." And he said, "Are you certain, anywhere at all?" And she said, "No, I'm not hurt. I'm ***." And Ansel Rook, who had a split lip and a knee still on the back of a struggling man, and who had just thrown away his career, his pay, his mother's rent, and every hour of the 6 years he had given that house, put his forehead down on the doorframe of that car for about 1 second, and then lifted it and said, "Good. That's the right thing to be." Then he took his hand away, and he did not pick her up. He said, "Will you come out to me?" And she came out to him, on her own 2 feet, and stood on the cobbles of the Greve Wharf in her pale coat with her hair coming out of its ribbon. And then she put her arms round his neck, and then he picked her up, and only then did she start to cry, the great furious wrenching sobs of a child who has been brave for 11 minutes and can now, at last, afford not to be. He stood up with her, and he turned round, holding her and the wharf, 400 people, on a bridgehead on Charter Day, who had watched a hatless guardsman come down 38 steps and open a car door, made a sound that the shrimp seller said she had never heard before and hopes never to hear again, because it was not a cheer. It was not a cheer at all. She said it was the sound a crowd makes when it works out, all together in 1 second, what it has just been standing next to. Then he did the practical things in this order. I have them from the record, and I set them down because they are the measure of the man, and because when people ask me what a royal guard actually is, this is the list I give them. He got his tunic off and put it round her, because she was shaking, and it was a raw morning off the river, and a red wool ceremonial tunic is the warmest garment in Eldermore. She was entirely swallowed by it. He rolled the cuffs back twice so that her hands came out. He asked her again whether she was hurt, and looked at her hands and her wrists himself, and satisfied himself, and said so out loud to the crowd, "She's not hurt, she's not hurt," because he understood even then that 400 people needed to hear it. He gave Ilse Fenn, who had got out of the car and was standing very upright by the wing of it, into the keeping of the 2 corn market porters and a bargeman named Hugh Tanner, with the words, "This woman is to be held for the provost. Nobody is to lay a hand on her." And when a man in the crowd said something ugly and moved forward, Rook put one arm out and said, "No, not here, not in front of the princess." And the man went back. He asked the bridge master to send down the river telegraph to the provost's station and to the palace, in that order. He asked Hugh Tanner's wife, Nan, who had come out of the bridge house with a shawl in her hands, whether there was a fire in there and a chair, and whether she would sit with them. And then he carried Malin into the bridge house of the Grieve Bridge, and sat down in a bridge keeper's chair by a bridge keeper's stove, which I do not think he noticed, and which I have never been able to think about without something happening to my throat, and he held her, with her face in the shoulder of his shirt, until she had finished crying. Nan Tanner made her hot milk with sugar in it. The barges went through, the bells rang, the great leaves of the bridge came down. And in the little brick house at the end of it, a 9-year-old princess of Eldermore sat wrapped in a royal guard's tunic on a fisherman's chair, drinking hot milk out of a chipped cup, while outside the window the whole eastern city stood on the wharf in complete silence, 400 of them looking at the door. Rook asked her nothing. That is the other thing I want on the record, because it was raised at the hearing, and some fool of a counselor tried to make it into a failure of duty. He did not question her. He did not ask her who the woman was, or what she had been told, or where they had been taking her, though he must have been on fire to know. He asked her whether she wanted her mother, and she said yes, and he said, "Then she's coming, and until she gets here you may have my tunic and Mrs. Tanner's fire, and you don't have to talk to anybody about anything at all." She fell asleep in the end, for about 20 minutes, with the cup still in her hands and a bargeman's wife on one side of her and a royal guard on the other, and the door shut against the world. Princess Alara came to the Grieve Bridge at 12 minutes, in the second car of a convoy that had been assembled in 8 minutes flat, and had come through a closed city at a speed that took the front wheel off a police motorcycle at the Corn Market. I was in the fourth car. Sergeant Major Grange had come up my stairs, taken the ledger out of my hands, closed it, put it under his arm, and said, "Bring your pen, Mistress Combe. You're a witness." And that is how a gate clerk of 11 years' standing came to be in a royal convoy on Charter Day, with the King's Own Standard on the wing, going east through streets where the crowds were still cheering for a procession that had by then entirely ceased to exist. Because it had stopped. That is a detail people forget. The Charter Day procession, the oldest public ceremony in the realm, the landau, the cavalry, the 200,000, had come to a dead halt on the Kingsway at 14 minutes past 11, when a mounted officer rode up alongside the king's carriage and told him. They say King Alaric stood up in the open landau. They say he stood up and he did not say anything, and he looked back down the Kingsway at the palace, and then he sat down and said very quietly, "Turn it round." And the whole of it turned round. Cavalry, band, standards, the charter itself in its case on its cushion. The entire apparatus of 400 years came about in the middle of the road and went back the way it had come, and the crowd, who could not hear and did not know, cheered it every yard of the way. What Alara did when she came into that bridge house is not mine to describe, and I will not, except for one thing which I think she would allow me. She did not go to her daughter first. I want to be careful, because that sounds like a criticism, and it is the opposite of one. She came through the door, and she saw Malin asleep in the chair with the red tunic round her and the cup in her hands, and she stopped dead in the middle of the room and put her hand over her mouth and stood there for about 3 seconds getting hold of herself, because she was not going to wake that child up by crying at her. And in those 3 seconds she looked at the young man standing at attention beside the chair in his shirt sleeves with his lips split, and his gloves black and his hair wet through. And Princess Alara of Eldermore crossed the room and took both his hands, and bent her head, and put her forehead against his knuckles. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to say. There was a bargeman's wife with her apron up over her face, and a sergeant major of 31 years standing in the doorway with his back to the room, and a gate clerk in the corner with a ledger she was holding much too tightly. Then Alara let go of him and went and knelt down by the chair and put her hand on her daughter's hair, and Malin woke up and said, "Mama, I didn't want to go. I said asterisk I didn't want to go. I said it out loud." And her mother said, I know you did, and he heard you." They took her home in the king's own car. And Ansel Rook, who could have ridden in it, who was invited to ride in it, who was told to ride in it, by the Crown Princess of Eldermore in a voice that was not a request, said, "Ma'am, I would rather not." And Alara, who was no fool, looked at him for a moment and understood and said, "Why?" And he said, "Because in about an hour I'm going to be arrested, ma'am, and it would be better for her if she doesn't see it happen in the same car she's just been comforted in." Alara said, "Nobody is going to arrest you." "Yes, ma'am," Rook said. "They are, and they should. I left my post on a state day, and I took a horse from the mews without an order, and I put my hands on a man in a public street. If they don't arrest me, then any guardsman may do those things on any morning he feels strongly about something, and then that tunic she's got round her is worth nothing at all." He looked down at her, the child, asleep again in the red wool. "It has to be worth something," he said. "That's the whole of it, ma'am. It has to be worth something, or it's just a coat." And he saluted, in his shirt sleeves with a split lip, on a wharf, and he stood back and let the car go. Then he walked over to the provost's men, and told them his name, his number, and his company, and held out his wrists. The scheme came apart in 4 days, and it came apart because of paper. That is the part nobody puts in the songs. The horse is in the songs. The 38 steps are in the songs. The paper is not, and the paper is what did it, and I would like just once for somebody to sing about the paper. Bertil Crane talked before they had got him back to the city. He was not a wicked man. He was a hired driver with a debt and a livery yard on Cutter's Row, and he had been engaged 8 days earlier by a soft-spoken gentleman's clerk to hold himself, and a saloon ready on charter day for a private conveyance out of the palace. A young lady, to be taken east over the Greve and up the coast road to a private establishment beyond the marches, delivered by nightfall, 30 crowns, no questions, and a further 20 if he did it without stopping. He had been told she was a difficult girl being sent to school and would very likely make a scene, and that it was a family matter, and that the household's own people would be with her. He had been given a warrant number to read out at the gate. He had asked the porter about the bridge because he had been warned about the bridge, and he had been told about the bridge, which meant that somebody in the consort's office had studied the tide tables of the Greve. They had planned everything except a guardsman who looked at boots. Corvin Slade, the man in household livery, a footman of the consort's, in a coat he had no right to wear that day, was taken at the Sheepgate that afternoon walking with 60 crowns on him. Ilse Fenn said nothing for 2 days, and then said a great deal. And the paper came in from every direction at once, the way it does when a thing has been arranged by people who have never in their lives had to hide anything, because nobody has ever asked them to account for a shilling. There was the conveyance warrant, drawn Tuesday from the private book of the consort's office, in the hand of Mr. Pell Dorance's clerk. There was the note in the porter's day-book, directing that the princess be conveyed to the abbey, and the writing master of the household, a dry old article who had taught 3 generations of that family to hold a pen, and who examined the note for 11 minutes with a glass, said in the flattest voice imaginable that the hand was Lord Cassius's, and that he knew it because he had corrected the same crooked lowercase *g* for 4 years, and had never managed to cure it. There was a receipt from the Institute at Vance Hollow, beyond the marches, for a deposit of 400 crowns received the previous Tuesday, together with an enrollment form for a pupil entered as *M. Harrowgate, age 9 *, signed by order of the consort's office *, with a note in the margin, family will not visit in the first term. And there was my ledger. They put it on the table in the council chamber, open, with the ink stain across the line, and they asked me to read out the entries of that morning in order, and I did. And then the Lord President asked me whether I had anything further, and I said yes, and I read them the column. The note that took Bell Havers to the Silver Room, timed and initialed by the footman who carried it. The change of stair that held Princess Alara under the colonnade, testified to by two ushers. The pigeons and the gloves and Lady Verena. The car, admitted at 10:23 on an equerry's word. The guardsman's report at 10:47, made properly, through his sergeant major, to the officer of the guard and refused. And the vehicle, out of the Ash Gate at 11:03, going east, on a road that leads to one bridge and one border and one school that does not permit visitors. I read it as a column because I am a clerk, and a column is what I have. When I finished, the council chamber was so quiet that I could hear the fire. Queen Consort Morwenna sat through all of it. I will say that for her. She did not run, and she did not faint, and she did not weep. She sat in a high-backed chair at the end of the table with her hands folded and her chin up, and she denied it in a clear, cold, perfectly reasonable voice. A family arrangement, a school of excellent reputation, a difficult and overwrought girl, a misunderstanding compounded by a hysterical guardsman and an officious clerk. She was very good. If she had stopped there, I think it might have taken a year. But Princess Adela, who had come in from the regiment still in her boots, and who had said nothing at all for 2 hours, and who was sitting with her arm along the back of her chair looking at her brother's wife the way you look at a horse you are not going to buy, Princess Adela said, into the silence. Then, why was the family not to visit in the first term? And Morwenna said, because the child was to be cared for, properly, away from that house and that mother and all of it. She was becoming difficult. She was watching people. She was carrying tales about my steward to her mother, and she is 9 years old and no one. And she stopped. She stopped because she heard it. You could see the exact instant she heard it. Her hands came apart on the table, and she looked at the king. King Alaric had not spoken in 2 hours either. He was a heavy, slow, kind man who had been trying for 10 years not to know what he knew, and he sat at the head of that table on the 4th day after Charter Day, and he looked at his wife for a long moment with an expression I hope never to see on anybody again. Then he said, "You knew where the car was going." And Morwenna said nothing at all, which was, in the end, the loudest thing she ever said. It went to law, and it went slowly, and it went properly, and that is exactly as it should have been, because the alternative, a household that punishes people in corridors, is the thing that made the whole business possible in the first place. Morwenna was stripped of her household warrant and of her private warrant book and of every authority, present or claimed, over the establishment of the king's grandchildren. The Household Establishment Bill was withdrawn from the council's table by the Lord President himself, who did it standing up, and who said, before he sat down, that a bill which would have put those children into the hands of that office was a bill that the council would remember with shame. She was removed from Harrowgate to her estate at Ravensmere and confined there under the council's order while the Lords of Session prepared their case, and the case took 14 months, and it went against her on every count that mattered. Her seals were taken. Her name came off the establishment. She never entered the palace again. Pell Dorrance was dismissed, committed, tried, and sentenced. So was Ilse Fenn. So was Corvin Slade. Bertil Crane gave his evidence and was sentenced to and served 11 months, and I saw him once afterward on Cutter's Row, and he crossed the street to avoid me. Lord Cassius, who had signed a car through a gate with his mother's warrant and written a note in a porter's book with his crooked *G*, was dismissed from the household of the King of Eldermore, and answered for it in a public court, and the crooked *G was read out in open session, and there is no punishment in the statute book worse than that, for a man like him. And nobody was flogged, and nobody was ruined in a cellar, and no one in that family took a private revenge on anybody, and the King of Eldermore never once laid a hand on his wife or raised his voice to her. It was all done in the light, on paper, in front of everybody, by the courts of the realm. Adela insisted on it. So to my everlasting surprise did Ansel Rook, from a cell, in writing, in a letter that was read to the council. If it is done in the dark, ma'am, then next time it can be done in the dark to us. They tried him, of course. They had to. He had left his post on a state day. There is no getting round it, and he never once tried to. He stood in front of the household's own court in a plain tunic with his hair cut and his hands at his sides, and he pleaded guilty to every charge they put to him. And when his own defending officer tried to argue necessity, Rook stopped him. He said, "Sir, I knew what I was doing when I did it. I would like the finding to say so." So the finding said so. Guilty of quitting his post, guilty of taking a horse of the royal mews without an order, guilty of failing to obey the lawful instruction of the officer of the guard. It is written in the household's book, and it has never been taken out, at his own request. And then King Alaric, who had sat in the gallery for the whole of it, and who came down onto the floor of the court to give judgment himself, which had not been done in 90 years, said this, and I copied it into my ledger that night, in the margin, and it is the only thing I have ever written in that book that was not a wheel or a warrant. The finding is confirmed. He left his post. Let it stand, and let it be read out to every man who takes that oath, so that no one imagines this is easy. And now let it be remitted wholly, and his rank restored, and his pay made good, because the oath is sworn to the crown, and not to the paving stone he stands on. I would rather this house had 100 men who could tell the difference than 1,000 who could not. Then he asked Ansel Rook what he wanted. He offered him a commission. Rook declined it. He offered him the captaincy of the princess's own guard, and Rook, who had thought about it, you could see that he had thought about it, declined that too, and said, when the king pressed him, that it would not be good for her, that she should have people about her who came to her out of duty, and not one man who came to her out of that day, because she would grow up, and one day she would want to be a person and not a rescue. He asked for 2 things. The first was that Dabney Quill be allowed to keep the gray horse Salter in the mews to the end of his natural life, at the crown's charge, and never be sold or worked, which was granted. Salter lived 9 more years and grew enormously fat and became, by universal agreement, the most insufferable animal in the kingdom. The second was mine. He asked that no query raised by a keeper of a gate register in any royal house should ever again be answered by an officer's word alone, that it be answered in writing, by the officer, within the hour, in the book itself, over his signature, and that the book be inspected monthly by the board. They call it the Rook Standing Order. It is 9 lines long. It is the least romantic document in the realm, and I have watched it stop 3 things since: a dubious van, a wrong name, a man with a story, and not one of them ever became a story, and that is precisely the point, and that is the whole of what a register is asterisk for asterisk. He went back to the Ashgate. He asked for it. 3rd Company, Ashgate Arch, the same 8-tower watch, and he has it still, and he is a sergeant now and has a wife in the Fen and 2 sisters who are both schoolmistresses on his pay. And every charter day since, at 19 minutes past 10, a girl comes down through the service court to the arch. She was 10 the first year, and 11, and then 12, and last spring she was 14 and taller than her mother, and she still comes at 19 minutes past 10 exactly, because she is her father's daughter and she is precise about things. She carries a folded red tunic over her arm. It is the one he put round her on the Grieve Wharf. The household tried to take it back and she would not give it up, and King Alaric, who by then had learned a great deal about what happens when people are not listened to, told them to leave it alone. She brings it down to the arch, and she gives it to him, and he holds it while she says good morning, and then she gives it back to her governess and goes off to the colonnade stand with her mother, cross about it, exactly as she has been every year of her life. They do not talk about that morning, not once in all these years so far as I know. They talk about the horses. And I sit up in my stone box above the arch with my window open, an old woman now, with a new ledger and a new pen and a girl of 19 under me learning the columns. And I watch them, and I write down the time. People ask me still what it was that stopped it. They want it to be the horse. Everyone wants it to be the horse, the gray gelding on the cobbles, the sparks, the 38 steps, the door of the car coming open at the bridgehead with the leaves up against the sky. It was not the horse. It was a man who looked at a driver's boots. It was a sergeant major who stepped aside. It was a fishmonger's daughter and a boy on a bicycle and a whole street of people who did not know why they were moving and moved anyway. It was a 9-year-old girl who pulled her hand back and said, "I am supposed to be with my mother," in a voice loud enough for a porter to remember. And it was a line in a book, one line, in a ledger the size of a paving slab, entered at 23 minutes past 10 on a bright cold morning by a clerk who did as she was told. That is the last thing I have to say, and I would like the young ones to have it, since I shan't be here forever. Write the line, write it exactly, write the time. And when the man on the gate tells you that something is wrong, and he cannot say why, and he has nothing in his hands but the look of a car and the mud on its sills, believe him first and check afterward. It costs nothing. It costs an hour and a little of your dignity, and the annoyance of a captain who is very busy placing 4 companies. And once, on a charter day, in a city full of flags, with everybody in the kingdom looking the other way, it will be worth a child.